You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm John Harris.
And today, John and I will be discussing the life and career of the pioneering photojournalist, Catherine Leroy. To do so, we welcome author Mary Cronk Farrell, who has just published a book about Leroy. The book is called Close Up on War, Story of Pioneering Photojournalist Catherine Leroy in Vietnam. And we'll give you the details of the book and on Mary in a minute. But first, a shout out to Pelican for sponsoring this episode of the B&H Photography Podcast. Check out the link in our show notes to the Pelican products on the B&H site. Of course, they do backpacks, lighting, flashlights, and of course, watertight cases. All neat stuff. Okay, let's welcome author Mary Cronk Farrell to the show. Mary is a writer of books for young adults, and she specifically writes the stories of little-known women whose strength and courage helped shape our history. Her books such as Pure Grit, about nurses in World War II, Fanny Never Flinched on Fanny Sellens, and the fiction Fire in the Hole have earned her several awards, including the New York Public Library Best Books for Teens Prize, the Spur Award for Best Juvenile Fiction, and a nomination for the Washington State Book Award. Mary is also a former radio and television journalist, including a stint as a reporter for KXLY-TV in Spokane, Washington, which is where she's joining us from today. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I tell you, we read the book. It's a phenomenal book, phenomenal story. And I want to qualify this to those who heard that, you're writing, young adult books. I want to tell you, I'm not a young adult. Okay. I've been around the block a few times. The book is terrific. The story is amazing. It's beautifully written. Just totally blew me away. In a nutshell, you've got Catherine Leroy. She's a young French woman. She loves photojournalism, especially the work of Robert Capa. She looks at pictures in Paris Match magazine. She has no real experience, and then she goes and buys a one-way ticket to Vietnam. She has a Leica camera that she barely knows how to use. She's about 5 feet tall, 85 pounds, and she's going to be a war photographer. Within 2 years, her work starts appearing in Life magazine, Look, Time, and yes, Paris Match. And she was the first woman to win the George Polk Award for News Photography, given to her for her work in covering the Battle of Hill 881 in Vietnam in 1967. And she went on to a long career after that. The story is absolutely amazing. And keep in mind, this is back in the 60s. Nobody took her seriously, and even she had doubts about how she was going to do it, but she knew that this is what she wanted to do.
Yes, I particularly liked. I decided to write the story when I found the research that, in her own words, talked about her own doubts and fears and misgivings, as well as her tremendous ambition, which she did not voice openly. She was not a self-promoter in any way, but privately, she was very ambitious.
That's really, you look at that, she had very high goals and she was determined to get there. And it blows me away is that I never heard of her. And mind you, I was around in those days. I remember this. The only reason I didn't go to Vietnam is because I was 363 in the draft lottery when I was 18. I would have been there myself. And I'm reading this stuff and I'm just totally blown away by this whole thing. The whole undertaking is just amazing.
And Mary, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, your book really chronicles her arrival in Saigon in 1966. But maybe you can set the stage for us a little bit. I mean, as Alan pointed out, she didn't have a lot of experience, and here she is showing up in a situation where at the time there were no women working as a photojournalists in the sphere of the Vietnam War. Can you kind of just give us a little, scenario as to how things might have been for her when she showed up?
Well, I'll start kind of with a bit of background. Catherine was supposed to be a concert pianist. That's what her parents wanted her to do. And she dropped out of school for all means and purposes when she was about 14. There was one point where she had a boyfriend who was a skydiver, and she decided they were going to maybe run a skydiving business, and that didn't really work out. And so then she started working at a temp agency and saving money because she had this goal of being a war photographer. And as soon as she had enough money to buy the camera, buy the one-way ticket, and a little spending cash, she took off, flew right to Vietnam. She actually landed in Laos first and went around sort of like a tourist taking pictures there. I think she was getting used to the camera. And then she landed in Saigon, and she had one contact. Someone on the plane was a friend of another photographer and said, go to the Associated Press office and check in with this guy, Horst Foz. So that's what she did the day she woke up there, made her way to that office. And when she walked into that room, everyone stared at her. Horst Foz had been in Vietnam for a few years, and he had been a photographer before he became the AP manager there. And he had seen a lot of, he called them wannabe photographers, come and go. He said they were, in 2 weeks, they either gave up and left or they were killed. And so he looked at her, and she looked like a child. She admitted she looked like a child, but he saw something in her, and he said, okay. He gave her some rolls of film, and she said, what do I do? What kind of pictures do I take? And so he just opened a drawer and pulled out a bunch of prints there and showed her, and she said, okay. And she took off and left.
And in doing the research on her, and of course we'll talk more about the letters that you had access to. What do you think drove her? I mean, was it a sense of adventure? Did she really just love photojournalism so much that she wanted to report on things? I mean, it's not uncommon, even nowadays for freelancers to just kind of jump on a plane and try to get images from conflict zones. But in her personal case, I mean, what do you think was kind of her motivating factors, her driving force?
Well, right. I mean, there were men who were doing this, mm-hmm. thinking this is the way to fame and fortune.
Right.
So in that regard, she wasn't unique. And I don't know really what her motivation was, but I think that as a child, looking at those news photographs, something about them touched her.
And she, as you mentioned, arrived really with no support. I mean, she was a true freelancer, or as a stringer, as they're called. And, as you kind of point out in the book, there really was not a lot for her financially. She had just the clothes on her back in some sense, and barely a place to live. Even if she sold an image, it was selling for $15, when an image was published. So, how did she get by? I mean, can you kind of describe the life of a freelancer at that point?
Well, one of the ways she got by, which was unusual which contributed to her success, was because she didn't have much money. She just she rented a cheap room, and then she spent her time in the field with the soldiers, and they shared their rations with her. So she kind of was out there because at home she couldn't really support herself. So it was her existence. She at one point found some Beaujolais wine that was sold in cans in Saigon, and she would take a 6-pack of that to the field, and she would trade it to the soldiers for rations.
Wow. So she was just getting by any way she could. I mean,
I was also kind of taken. She actually did not carry a lot of rations with her because she couldn't carry it. Well, the weight was too much. She was carrying as much weight as these soldiers who are twice her size.
Right. And what amazes me is, as small as she was, and she herself said that she wasn't strong. I'm sure she grew stronger, but she kept up with those soldiers. And that's kind of what amazed me, that physically what she endured to be able to take the picture she wanted to take.
And she almost had to do that to have the respect and support of the soldiers, because otherwise she would be a liability to them.
Right, right. And I think she did have a lot of support from the soldiers in the field. She looked at them as kind of like her brothers. She was many of them were similar age. Um, she felt very. I think she began to feel very at ease with them.
Yeah, it must have been incredible. I mean, given that, she probably, was the only woman that many of these soldiers would have seen for weeks or months at a time, and if she was out there with them. But we've mentioned this a few times. It's really hard to imagine, though, someone who's just 85 pounds. I mean, that's a very tiny person, to be enduring what she endured, and perhaps we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the physical stress, let alone the emotional and mental stress of what she went through in really just a short amount of time, a couple of years, um, it took its toll on her. But one of the questions I wanted to get at, and or maybe you can describe this idea a little bit, is during the war in Vietnam, the press, and specifically photojournalists, had a bit more of a free reign. I mean, they were able to kind of just get where they if they could get where they wanted to go, they were able to kind of show up at a military unit and tag along for operations. There seemed to be this freedom that existed in that little window of time that didn't exist in previous wars and hasn't existed since. She also, in a way, was embedded with the troops. I mean, that's the phrase that we use nowadays. But at one point, she went on airborne missions, and she was able to jump from planes in parachutes. I mean, can you talk about that part of her work?
Yes. First, I'll just reiterate what you said. The Vietnam War was a very unique slice of time for news photographers, for photojournalists and journalists themselves. Catherine herself called it an experiment, and later, in her later years, she said it was an experiment that will never happen again. And I think it's very exciting to me just that what came together was the improved technology of the camera that happened around this time that enabled them to go anywhere. And the freedom, because I guess we'll say the government hadn't figured out yet that they wanted to control the press. So yes, a very unique slice of time for photojournalists. And she, as soon as she started to become successful, there was backlash among the press corps, the men who were there. And they had a lot of rumors about her. And I don't know really what all the rumors were, but one of the rumors, there was this one Operation Junction City was planned at the beginning of, I hope I'm right, 1967. It was the United States military's idea that this was going to be a huge parachute drop, and it was going to get the public behind the war because it would be reminiscent of World War II. So Catherine had been with the airborne on their missions. They did a lot of missions on the ground too. She was with them on the ground, and she was good friends with the colonel of this one battalion, and he knew her well and knew that she had skydived. So he said, "Hey, you want to go on this mission?" And it was a big secret. Nobody knew about it or when it was going to happen. And she said yes. And then it turned out it went all the way to Washington to get permission for her to make this jump. And they decided, as long as she was qualified, she could do it. So that really opened doors for women as far as doing something like that. But it turned out that that was the only parachute drop in the Vietnam War. The helicopters proved much more useful. So she went on this drop, and then the rumor started that she had gotten this opportunity because she had been intimate with the colonel. And there was another time when the press corps got so nasty with her, they actually went to the U.S. press office and got her press credentials revoked. And she was very upset because she said she would have to leave the country. Well, not leave the country, but she couldn't work, so she'd have to leave the country. And it was just pure spite that happened. One of the French photographers who was good friends with her went and spoke to the press office, and he asked her for her to be reinstated. He said that he never knew if that was why she was, but she was reinstated.
Well, it's interesting that, and I'm sure this wasn't 100% of the case, but, when you're in the field, the people around you support you in a way that those that aren't, might not. And certainly sounds like, in the field with the soldiers, she found the support that she might not have found, from her colleagues, at least at the beginning.
But she was also as down dirty as they were, at the end of the day, in the midst of all that misery. And it was an awful environment to be in.
Yeah, at one point she mentioned something like she hadn't had a change of clothes in 2 or 3 weeks. And yeah, it made me look a lot more closely at what happens in the field.
Yeah.
And what were the first kind of signs of success for her? I mean, as you document in the book, there were some early images that were purchased, and she was able to at least kind of feel she was getting some recognition for her work. But where were the steps that really started to get her noticed?
I would say within 9 months, she was turning in pictures that were being purchased regularly. And then one of her big breakthroughs was in the spring of 1967 when she covered the Battle of
Hill 881 in 1967. Yeah.
Yep.
This is an incredible story because she described exactly how she followed behind these Marines going up a hill that had been totally blasted with everything they threw in Vietnam. And so it was basically just a rugged mess of burnt sticks and rocks and dirt. And she was following the Marines up this hill where at the top, the North Vietnamese were dug in bunkers that they had been building for months. And one of the soldiers, American Marine, said the only way they'd get them out of there was to pull them out when they were dead. So these waves of Marines going up to the top of this hill, it was war at its core. And she was right behind them, climbing up that hill, and she saw this Navy corpsman who was like a medic run up to a soldier who had been hit. And these became her most famous photographs because she got a series of 5, and 3 of them are what you see a lot of. It was the corpsman basically feeling for a heartbeat, first he's like staunching the blood, then he's like listening for a heartbeat, and then he's just looking up he lifts his head and looks up like, I don't know if it's just horror or if it's, anyway, the expression on his face is what Catherine became famous for. She could capture a face, a moment that made the viewer, made whoever looked at that picture confront what they were seeing. And another thing I will add, just because of your audience, is that these were very poor conditions. She had a few. She had a few shots left on her roll. She wasn't even sure how many, and the light was fading. And she snapped these pictures, and she did not even know if they would turn out. And she sent them back. Oftentimes, the photographers didn't go back to Saigon to like the AP bureau. They stayed where they were, or they went somewhere else, and they sent their film back with other reporters or sometimes just with the Army press people. And she sent directions to Horst Foz that these would be low light, and he would have to consider that when he was developing them. And he said that there was something about those negatives, that he had not seen pictures like that in his entire time in Vietnam. And Catherine didn't even know until later, after they'd been published. I mean, that's what's strange about, I guess, being a freelancer, is you just keep sending in these negatives, and you don't know which ones they pick. You don't know who publishes what. So it was a few weeks before I think she knew what a splash that these photos were making.
But yeah, that's an incredible story that you really document well in your book, and the photos are there. I did want to ask a bit about the gear, because it's something that comes up a lot in her letters that you've, again, you put in the book, where she's writing back home saying, "I only have this one Leica camera. I need another. There's no way I can do with just one camera." And then
One
ultimately
camera for black and white, one for color, and then she needs other lenses. The whole
Right. And I was kind of curious how she was affording that at the time, because those cameras even then weren't cheap. But one by one, she kind of built up her arsenal. Do you know from your research what she was photographing with?
I do know that she was constantly saving up money to buy more equipment. And I have a photograph of her where she has 3 cameras around her neck. So she's just there with a big smile, 3 cameras, and that's in a French.
That's all it takes for a photographer. 3 cameras and you're happy. By the way, just as a point, just from what I picked out in the book, the name Leica was mentioned as the camera she went with, but didn't mention any focal length lens that I noticed. And when she did get access to a Nikon F, it was with a 105 2.5 lens, which was like a classic lens and still is to this day. But I didn't notice any other mention of other cameras or lenses, except that there were others. So I didn't notice any details about that.
Yeah, she didn't. I put what details she noted in there, but there wasn't a lot. There was one, I don't know if she said this or I read this somewhere, that when she did the parachute drop, she borrowed a camera because she didn't think she, at that point, had what she needed.
And there is a story that you do mention in the book, and sadly, at some point, she did sustain serious injuries. I mean, there was I believe it was a grenade or a mortar blast near her that injured her. But she claims that having her cameras might have saved her life. I mean, they seem to take some of the damage that her body might have otherwise received.
Yes, when she took that mortar blast, she didn't really know what had happened to her, but as soon as she kind of regained enough consciousness to know what was going on, she had already been taken back to a place where they were collecting the wounded. And at that point, when she kind of figured things out, what her thought was, I want to get my film out and get it sent back to Saigon, and she was having trouble opening the camera. And that's when she realized that the camera had been damaged by, which was right around her neck on her chest, and there was blood on the camera, and it had been damaged. And so I think maybe it did save her life.
Gotcha. Well, she seems to have suffered greatly, and PTSD is maybe a phrase she wouldn't use, but I mean, going into some situation like this, the ambition and the courage is clear, but often there's a payoff for that. I mean, would you say that, this period of her time, despite the fact that it did bring her maybe the recognition that she was seeking, was a kind of something that gave her lifelong suffering?
Yes, well, you mentioned that she was 21 when she went over there, and it's going through this book, it seems like she was there for years, but she was 23 when she went home. And she said that what she said was, I was extremely shell shocked. She really didn't do any work for a year. At one point, she said, I was filled with the sound of death and the smell of death. And she felt alienated from mainstream life in the way that many of the combat veterans did. Isolated. No one really wants to talk to you about what happened over there. So what really kind of pulled her out, I think, was when she met some veterans who were protesting the war, and one of them was Ron Kovic, and they got together and made a film involving Vietnam veterans at home protesting the war. And that film, well, Ron Kovic wrote that book, Born on the 4th of July. It was made into a movie. I think that's what pulled her out. She finally maybe got a little healing with those other veterans.
I'd like to take an opportunity to read a little quote here from her. And it goes, on the surface, I was extremely cool under fire. I didn't show any emotion. In fact, I didn't show anything. But when I went back to Saigon, sometimes with human brain on my fatigues, the horror of it would hit me, and I would sleep for 20, 30 hours straight. You have to turn yourself off to do this kind of stuff, but there's a limit to how long you can do that, and ultimately, you have to go through it. You have to work your way through it, what you've seen, what you've lived through.
Right. And I'm not sure she ever really did. Even though she covered many other wars around the globe, Vietnam had been very formative for her. And in her later years, she was trying to bring attention to the Vietnam War, not herself, but other photographers and the great photographs that they had taken. And she also suffered physically. I mean, she had shrapnel in her body for the rest of her life. She also lost her hearing in one ear from I don't know when that happened. At one point, she was in the hospital getting her foot taken care of because it was hurting for some reason. So yeah, mental and physical costs to her work.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, more with Mary Cronk Farrell on Catherine Leroy. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back with Mary Cronk Farrell, and we're discussing Catherine Leroy, photojournalist. But let's talk about what you do, Mary, and that is writing for young adults. And I want to qualify something I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I found it to be a very good read, extremely good read. And what I really appreciate is that even though I lived through that time, you really summed it up very well, the background of what that war was about, what led up to it, what was there. And it actually gave me a very good understanding, a little clearer understanding that I even had back then. And you did that very well. As a story, it's excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about, what kind of perspective you take or attitude, however you want to put it, is required when you're writing for young adults? How do you get your mindset?
Well, yes, first let me just say thank you. I am so appreciative to hear how much you enjoyed the book. I will say it went back and forth between me and my editor 5 times because when I wrote my first nonfiction book about women, about POW nurses in World War II, that was a huge story, and there were other books about those women that were more like written by professors. They were footnoted and researched, and they're fabulous. Of course, I read every word of them before I wrote my book. But what I kind of started developing then was this idea that the more succinct you can describe something, the more powerful it can be. And I never really think about the fact I'm writing for teenagers because teenagers are just as bright as most adults. And actually, my audience is mostly adults as far as who buys them. Um, they're sold by the publisher to school and libraries, and then the buyers, of course, at bookstores or online or not. Teenagers aren't going on there and buying the books. But I hope that like grandparents will buy them for their for their grandchildren. That's my hope.
Well, I don't see why not, honestly, seriously.
No, the book is I agree with you, Alan. It was a good read and lots of material, and it laid out complicated issues about the war, about photography, about being a woman in the situation, and then came back to talk about Catherine Leroy. So I found it just all in all just a really interesting read.
At the very end of the book, you took the time to describe what is involved in taking a photograph with a film camera back in the 60s compared to taking pictures with an iPhone. And you're describing them functionally and how you approach it, but you really talk about the contrast of what was involved from loading the camera to taking the picture, setting the exposure, sending it off. Everything that's involved with film that is totally absent from the smartphone experience of taking pictures. And there are amazing photographs taken with smartphones, but it's a different world. And the way you described it, like the rest of the book, at the end of the paragraph, I go, that was amazing. That's exactly what the difference is right there. You nailed it.
Well, that was so important to me because I'm old enough to have used a camera that you have to that you have to wind the film in. and I thought that kids today would have no way of understanding what Catherine accomplished if they didn't understand that, because the pictures for them are nothing. You just snap them, or you don't even snap them.
Well, for what it's worth, there actually is a revival of film cameras, especially amongst young people who are just taking it as something totally refreshing, and the analog experience itself has come back a lot, and that's part of it. But again, just the way you wrote that could be a little primer for anybody who wants to know the difference between what was and what is.
For example, in the book, the paragraphs are generally shorter than they might be in quote unquote a book for adults. And you also include a glossary, and as Ella mentioned, the description of how to use a film camera. What are some of the elements that make a young adult's book?
Well, what we call back matter, the glossary and any other informational text in the back, that is standard for this type of book that will be used in libraries and schools. The short paragraphs, that's basically, I think, just my writing style. I write that way in fiction too. So I don't know. I mean, the one thing that's important for writing for teens with this kind of book is you can't assume any prior knowledge. And that is one of the things I pay most attention to. If I mention something from the 1960s, I have to make sure they can understand what that is and put it in some kind of context. I can't, it wouldn't be exciting to read if I was explaining everything as I went along. So I think that is one of the major things that I work on, is putting things in context in a way that doesn't interrupt the story.
Also there's a lot of photos in the book, and that makes sense for a book about a photographer. But is that something that you include in young adult literature and nonfiction specifically because images are easier to digest and they help the story along, or was that because of this particular story?
Well, of course they were. Her photos had to be in this book. My other books have a lot of photographs as well. And my idea with that is I want a teen to be able to pick up the book, open it, and be drawn in. And even, most teens are not voracious readers. Most teens are going to look at a screen before they look at a book. So I think the photographs are a way of drawing the reader in, no matter what page, they're looking at.
Right. And can you talk a bit about obtaining the photos? I mean, most of the photos in the book are hers, if I'm not mistaken. There are others that are there for reference. But did you have to dig through a lot of archives? Did the family help? Did you have to go to the agencies you worked for, AP and such?
If I may add, the captions looked like they were the original captions that were on the back of the photographs in many cases.
Right. From the moment I discovered Catherine and thought about writing this book, I knew that I couldn't write it without her photographs. And I also knew from my previous books that photographs are expensive. The permission to use copyrighted photographs are expensive. So the other problem I had was I couldn't track down who owned the copyright. I learned about her on a website that had been put up about her, but they didn't ever return my contact information. And so it took me 18 months to track down someone who could even explain to me who owned the photographs. And when Katrine died, a number of her friends wanted to preserve her work and her story. And they went to her mother, who was her only living relative, and asked her if she would contribute. And so what I believe happened is that when her mother died, her estate, or part of her estate or whatever, went to form a foundation particularly to preserve Katrine's work and her life story. And so when I first started doing the research, I think this website was just sort of getting off the ground. It's called Dotation Leroy, and that's the French. There's an English version. I think it's like a foundation, and the next thing that happened was when I spoke with this chairman of the board who had been a friend of Katrine's, he was very excited and happy that I was going to write the book, and he was very supportive. We were allowed to use 40 photographs, and picking out those photographs was very difficult. They sent me probably 100 or 150 of her photographs, and I chose which ones I wanted in the book.
Oh, you made the final decision then on that?
Right.
Yeah, wow. And when you say they, this is the foundation. They organized the images and were able to get them to you?
They had them, and at the point when I was doing this research, they were I guess what they were doing was gradually converting her photographs to digital. So as I was doing the project, more photographs became available. And I think today there are still more photographs becoming available as they do this work.
Interesting. And another aspect of the book that, really provides the framework for it are the letters that she wrote home to her mother and father. And needless to say, it really adds an element to the book. It gives insight as to what she was thinking. It personalizes her. Can you speak a little bit about, finding those letters, having access to them, and then deciding to use them in the book?
Yes, when I discovered, I just ran across a mention of Katrine on the internet. There was an article about her in the New York Times or something, and I saw a couple, and I read about her, and I was like, wow, why haven't I heard of this woman? And so I didn't really at first think about writing the book. It wasn't until I found the letters, because there were letters mentioned in this article that I read online, and then I found this early version of the foundation website where they had translated a few of her letters and put them up to be read. And before I found them, I thought she was an incredible woman, and her photographs were incredible. But when I thought about writing a book about her, I didn't really have anything to say, because I'd say she went to Vietnam and she took these pictures. It wasn't until I found the letters that I realized I could do a book, because the letters put me in her shoes, so to speak, in her combat boots. I mean, her personal feelings that she wrote to her mother and father, that she never, I'm sure, expected anyone to read, but it helped me to make this Katrine's story. Much of the book comes from the letters and from her notes, so it's very personal and it's very close. And so the letters really were crucial to the book.
And it was her parents that had saved the letters all this time?
I assume it was her mother who saved them, and then and then they were left to the foundation.
And I'm also assuming that you do include letters, actual, photos of the letters and then transcribed versions, but I'm assuming there's a lot more, that you were able to read and have access to, or is that not true?
That's correct. There were about 100 letters, and it was, as with the photographs, it was very difficult to choose because there was so much. But I just had decided to open each chapter with a bit from a letter to kind of set the stage. And then I used information from the letters. But the foundation is planning, I think, to do another book with the letters, which will be incredible.
Interesting. I'm going to read a quote of yours, and maybe we'll include this in here. It just says, "I was drawn by the naked ambition in her letters, the drive that fueled her success, as well as her doubts, tears, anger, and discouragement." I think that kind of sums it up pretty well. And yeah, and you see that. And I really love that aspect of the book, because you're right. There's a lot of information and you're reading about it, but then the chapter starts with her own words, and you kind of get a sense of who this person is. And needless to say, very young and ambitious. I thought that was very clear. So interesting, needless to say.
And honest too. There's a lot of honesty in those little quotes and those little notes. There really is.
Right. The letters are interesting in one way, that she's very honest about a lot of things. But on the other hand, she's not very honest about the danger she's in. She sent some of the letters even sound frivolous. Mom, send me this blue bikini and this white blouse.
But she was also trying to keep her parents from freaking out too.
Right.
Because they're little girls in a war zone.
Right. And also, I want to say one of the first letters I read was when she asked her mom to send her tampons. And when I read that, I was just like, okay, this book is a way to show teens what it would be like for a young woman to be in a war zone, because that is something you just never think about.
A very good point. Good point.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump back a little bit to talk about, the last year, perhaps, of Katrine's time in Vietnam, because after she was injured, she went back to the field and continued working for another year, and the work there seems to have grown exponentially in terms of her access and even the quality of work. And I noticed at that point she also started shooting more color. Can you talk a little bit about some of those situations, including when she went across the enemy lines and photographed the North Vietnamese soldiers?
Well, it was interesting to me that she was wounded, and then within several months, 2 months, she was back on the front lines. She was actually on the beach at Da Nang for a swim when she heard about the attacks of what became known as the Tet Offensive. And so she just grabbed her equipment and, with another photographer, caught a ride up to the city of Hue, which was where the biggest and longest of the fighting ended up going on. And as they were approaching town, it was empty. The civilians were hiding, and it was unclear really where the lines were for the battle. They had a young boy with a white flag, and Katrine was yelling in Vietnamese, "I'm French press from Paris." She didn't want them to think she was American. Before they had entered where they thought they would encounter the enemy, she had put all her identification papers in her bra so that she wouldn't. Hopefully, they wouldn't be discovered if anything happened. And so when all of a sudden they did see this group of Vietnamese soldiers, the soldiers appeared hostile, but what I thought was really interesting was Catherine said seeing their faces was the first time that she really understood them as far as being, I guess I want to say, human. Of course, she knew they were human, but it was different when she actually saw their faces, and she felt less afraid then. They were taken into this compound, and their cameras were taken away, and they were put in this room with some other prisoners. And after a while, a higher ranking officer came and spoke with them and gave them back their cameras, but they were still being held captive. They weren't allowed to go. And Katrine asked if she could take some photographs. She said, I'm doing a story for a French newspaper about how this battle is going from the North Vietnamese side, or something like that. She convinced them. And so she began to take pictures. But she said this wasn't a great journalistic moment. She was frightened, and she didn't know what was, she didn't know what would happen.
It turns out, though, that the images, played very well, right? I mean, this got her a spread in Life magazine, if I'm not mistaken. No.
Right. So this became her biggest scoop. To have there weren't pictures of the North Vietnamese, and this battle then also became very huge in the American consciousness. So the pictures were unique. It was a moment of history, and she had something no other photographer had.
I think that one of the final touches on the story, which makes it terrific, is that at the very end, to leave, she just said, "Well, we have all the pictures we need. Thank you," and they walked out. I mean, which I think is terrific. I mean, it's like, whoever thought you'd do that? I mean, really, look where they are and look what they did.
Yeah. This was another thing where I read once where some people say she charmed her way free from the North Vietnamese. Well, I don't know if Katrine ever charmed her way anywhere. She wasn't known for her charm, but I think at that point she was a journalist, and what she wanted to do was take pictures, and then what she wanted to do was get away with the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it was really amazing that they just said, well, we better get going.
And so she, finished up her time. I mean, can you kind of speak to what made her decide, all right, it's time to leave and to get out of this? I mean, was she just so burnt and so devastated that she needed to, or was there, kind of a conscious decision? I mean, I know her career had improved. She was picked up by well-known agencies and she became a staff photographer. But what was her, the decisions for leaving Vietnam?
Well, I definitely think she had kind of reached a point where she had had enough. But the other thing was that she had ideas, she had projects going. She had a plan to make a movie, a 1 hour documentary about Vietnam, and she was thinking she could get funding for that. And I think at that point, honestly, she was thinking, I'm going to leave and my career is going to take the next step.
Right. 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 And who had hired her at that point? Do you know? She went on staff. Did she get the job with Black Star that she was looking for, or
She did. She got that. She got taken on by Black Star, and she had a regular payment, and then per month, payment per month, and then she got 75% for every photo
yeah,
that was sold.
yeah, quite a difference. I mean, if you look at the really just 2 years prior, she was making $15 for a published image, and that's it. And then as a Black Star photographer, Black Star being one of the more well-known photojournalism agencies. She had a monthly stipend of, I think it was 5,000 francs and 75% of whatever images that were published. Quite a difference, needless to say.
That's a working salary.
Yeah, I think she got that. The pictures she took at Hill 881, she received the award for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is when I think that's when she was able to get a contract, when she was back in New York.
I see. The one award that she really wanted was the Robert Capa Gold Medal Award, which she did not win for those images in Vietnam, but she did win several. She did win that award several years later.
1976 for the Lebanese Civil War. That's when
exactly.
She got it. Yep.
Exactly. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that stage of her career and what happened in the 70s and 80s.
What happened was she took about a year off, and then what really happened was then the end came in Vietnam, and she had to go back. She said, I had to go back. I had to be there. And so she went, and took pictures of the North Vietnamese coming into Saigon, the United States last people leaving from the embassy by helicopter, and then the North Vietnamese coming in. And then it was a short time later, the bombing in Beirut, and she was off to the Middle East, and she spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East. She actually was kidnapped by some soldiers there at one point too, and was able to get away. Although I think maybe that was a little. I think she went through a little bit more trouble with that instance, but she said. She said that it was in her blood, that she had to go back, and she continued to cover conflict.
I'm kind of curious that, after that, she continued to work, as a photojournalist covering conflict for several years, but she ended up living in New York and made her life at the Hotel Chelsea, which is actually, I can see it from my window. Which is true. But ultimately, she ended up running a vintage clothing store, which I found kind of interesting, and retired from photojournalism to do that. Do you have any information on kind of how the last years of her life were?
Well, I do want to say that she had trouble getting photo assignments. There are other male combat photographers who retire and come back and make a good living. Part of it was that she really refused to do anything like publicity shots in Hollywood or anything like that. She just would not do anything that she didn't feel was important. And she did take assignments, for instance, covering the Mohawk ironworkers in New York City. And that was one of her favorite assignments. She was picky, I guess, about what she wanted, but I also think she was not given the opportunity that the men were given. She did she was always into fashion. You could tell she was talking about clothes all the time when she was in Vietnam. And so when she retired, she went and did a lot of photography in Japan, fashion photography. So she did that for a while. And then she had other projects that in her later years, she had other projects that she was working on. And one of those was she wanted to put together a big exhibition in Washington near the Vietnam Memorial. And she had a big idea of it having photographs. And she couldn't get funding for that. People weren't as interested in that as she wanted them to be. She also, honestly, she was hard to work with. Sometimes she sometimes she was her own worst enemy. Another thing was the Afghanistan-Iraq war had started, and she felt that people like her who had been in Vietnam had something to say about whether we should go to war like that again. And she felt that nobody appreciated her point of view or what she might have to share. So I think she had a lot of frustration in those years. She died young. She died at 61, 62.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that, as Alan said, and, as your work kind of points out, that her name is not a common name, when we think about photojournalists of that era. And that's a big mistake, especially given the work she did and her specific situation, I mean, and to that, I want to congratulate you on the book, needless to say, and for getting this story out there. It is kind of a shame to see what kind of happened. You do see that often with some combat photographers. I mean, the adrenaline and the life of that kind of work brings such highs that it's kind of hard to repeat later in life. And needless to say, there's a lot of pain and damage that has been done from all the things that people have seen.
I kind of wanted to hint at that in the author's note at the end, because I think when you do have ambition like that, sometimes there's a cost. And for all of us, for most of us, it's not a cost like having PTSD and waking up. I mean, she woke up with nightmares and sweats for all of her life. For most of us, the cost of what our ambition is not that extreme, but I think there is always a cost, and often it's worth paying. I wanted to say something about that if you have a dream, it's going to require work and it's going to require a cost. But if you really want that, go for it and you can succeed.
Yeah. All right, then. I will throw in as maybe a last thought that, her final assignment, and maybe bringing things full circle, it was in 2005, just a year before she passed away. And it was for Pre-Match, the magazine that's kind of started it all for her. They sent her to Arizona for a reunion with the soldier who she had photographed in that famous sequence of 3 images, whose name is Vernon Wyke. And that was to be her last photo assignment. So, I mean, despite all the work that she did throughout her career, it all seems to come back to this, to those kind of 2 horrible years in Vietnam.
Right. I think that pretty much says it. She was very indelibly marked by those 2 years when she was very young.
All right. That is a wrap of another podcast. I truly enjoyed the story and speaking with you, Mary. Mary Cronk Farrell, thank you so much for joining us today and enlightening us on the story of Catherine Leroy, an amazing photojournalist who unfortunately is not very well known. And hopefully through your book, more people will learn about her. And learn what it takes to make a difference in this world. It's a magnificent story. It's beautifully written, and I recommend it not only to young teens but to older teens and adults as well. It's a great piece of writing. It really, really is. If people would like to catch up with more of your work and then Catrine's work, where can they go to?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I just appreciate any opportunity to talk about Catherine and the work she did. You can find out more about her at Foundation Catherine Leroy, or in French, it's Dotation Catherine Leroy. And you can find out more about me and the other books I've written at my website, which is my name, marycronkfarrell.com.
And again, Mary, thank you so much for joining us again. And again, all of those links will be in the show notes. And thanks again to Pelican for sponsoring today's show. Pelican manufactures amazing cases and lights and all kinds of terrific gear. I've got a bunch of Pelican products in my closet and in my bags. If you love our show and want to make sure you never miss an episode, all you have to do is head on over to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you snag your favorite podcasts. Enter B&H Photography Podcast into the search field. Boom, you're one of us. It's easy. And we can always be found on the B&H Explorer website. As always, my name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.